Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Massey College is a place for ideas. It's a place that has as a mission to nourish learning and serve the public good. Therefore, it has lots of responsibilities. Massey College, the physical location of Massey, is built on Indigenous land, on the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're always very grateful for the ability to continue to do the work here. So the Massey Dialogues come from the idea that to serve the public good, we have to talk across generations, we have to talk across disciplines, and sometimes involve everyone in the conversation. And that's what we're going to try to do today. I am here with, I want to welcome my guests. I am so pleased that they've agreed to do this. We will hear from a great leader, a man for whom I and many Canadians have lots of admirations, Phil Fontaine, a man who led the AFN for several mandates and has been an inspiration for many people. He will talk a little bit about what his vision is and what are the next steps are necessary for reconciliation. And then we will hear from the junior fellows, from the voice of the young, from Mia McKie, who will be responding with her perspective on this question. And finally, I'm delighted that we will have Senior Fellows Bob Rae commenting as well on the future and what we should expect in terms of the next steps for reconciliation. I also expect that there will be some questions from you, and please, you can type your questions on your screen, and we will be I will be asking your questions to our guest as the program goes on. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Mr. Fontaine, for agreeing to do this and celebrate the fact that you are new senior fellows at Massey. So we are delighted that you've agreed to our invitation. And I know that you're in Calgary now and that it's snowing, so we're happy that you're well, but knowing that being surrounded by snow as I'm seeing outside here, and my tulips are coming up. So we wanted to talk about reconciliation, and you suggested let's talk about the next steps. Where are you on this issue? Are you, you haven't given up? Are you discouraged? What's your perspective on what we should do? What are the next steps for this journey?
Well, first of all, thank you for your very kind invitation to join Massey College as a fellow. I'm really honored to be part of this very important institution, and in particular for this afternoon's conversation about reconciliation. I was at a breakfast meeting a few weeks ago, before the shutdown here. I had been invited by a group of oil and gas people to join them at breakfast and to have a conversation. And I was pleasantly surprised in the Q&A part when one of the participants made the point that reconciliation, in his view, was the most important conversation taking place in this country, and that it was an important challenge for all Canadians to take it seriously and to try and figure out together what that means on an individual basis, but also what it means in terms of our institutions, the economic interest, and other important entities in the country. And I was quite pleased to hear that from this group, because there's been a real disconnect between the oil and gas sector and Indigenous peoples. And I'm afraid that that reflects the perspective held by many in the different sectors in Canada, and so it's a significant challenge. But you asked me if I was discouraged or optimistic about things. I certainly am not discouraged. I'm very much optimistic. We have a lot of good people that are focused on this matter, including our friend here, Bob Rae. On many occasions has led the charge to make things better for all Canadians. And when we make it better for all Canadians, we certainly are going to make it better for the Indigenous peoples, the First Peoples. So in saying that, I recognize that there are many challenges before us, because I view reconciliation as largely about relationships. And the sad story here in Canada is that there are many broken relationships. And so the challenge is to repair those relationships. And meaning that in order to be effective about that, about repairing relationships, we're going to have to focus on land issues, probably the largest single challenge in the country, and we saw that before the shutdown with the Wet'suwet'en people and the blockades and protests in various parts of the country. Land. So when we talk about land, we're talking about treaties. We're talking about one of the most important relationships in Canada is the treaty relationship. We're talking about the Indian Act and how that's has had a stranglehold on our people since 1876. So we've had various interpretations of the Act through the amendments that have been introduced over time. We're talking about Indigenous legal traditions and how those will be incorporated in our country, in our country's legal system. Because when I say Indigenous traditions, I'm reminded of the work that went into bringing forward the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement.
Yeah.
That was largely based on Indigenous legal traditions.
Yeah.
And we were really fortunate that we had Justice Frank Akabuchi as the federal representative, because he understood the significance of proceeding in that direction. And we clearly were not just focused on money. We wanted to get other important considerations incorporated in the settlement agreement. The most important being the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came forward with the 94 calls to action, and of course the focus there was on reconciliation, and reconciliation then was described as a journey, a collective journey, and to complete that process or that journey, we're going to have to take a lot of steps together, including, as I said, fixing some of these relationships that are related to treaties, to land issues, to governance issues, to child welfare, the Indian Act, and such matters. And as I said, it's not going to be easy, but I think we're well on track to bring about some significant improvements in the way we relate to one another, Canadians with Indigenous peoples. I mean, keep in mind that we've been around as a country since 1867. I mean, the first encounter was about 500 years ago. It's 1867. What are we talking about now? 153 years? Canada still does not recognize Indigenous peoples as one of the founding nations of Canada. And you have to keep in mind that Canada wouldn't exist as it does if not for the generosity of Indigenous peoples. So the absence of that recognition, we have to try and figure out how we bring that about. And I think that's that's not, in my view, it shouldn't be hard. It should be one of the easiest things to do. But as I was told by one of the senior officials in Ottawa, when we first raised this issue and how we might fix it, we were reminded, or at least, we were reminded how difficult an issue this was, and maybe we shouldn't touch it. We should forget about it until the next time. And as I said then, the next time, gosh, 150 years from now, I won't be around. Either Bob, maybe Bob will be around, but I certainly won't be. And so the challenge is what to do about that now. Mm-hmm. And we're not talking about a constitutional process. We're thinking about something that would be a lot simpler than that. Mm-hmm. But given the complexity of that being suggested by a number of people, this certainly wouldn't be the easiest thing to do. But in our view, it's the logical step. It's a logical step that ought to be taken. So that's one major piece in trying to fix the relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. And clearly, in my view, there has to be some very serious discussions about this particular matter. Because everything else that I noted here, the treaties, the treaty relationship, governance-related matters, the Indian Act, child welfare, and the like, I mean, they flow from this matter of recognizing Indigenous peoples as equal to the French and the English in terms of founding the country and what that would mean in terms of recognition of the unique rights and interests of the Indigenous peoples.
So that's an agenda of recognition in a constitutional sense, a little bit of a meta message in a way that would from there would draw all sorts of transformative aspect of many relationships that you mentioned. Do you think that sometimes we went to some of the easy ways to respond to some, we wanted to have a little bit quick wins in managing the new relationship? Are they? Do you see steps? Do you see that there are things that could be done to create the momentum so that people feel encouraged to pursue these efforts of reconciliation? I think the great work that was done to respond to the residential school took a lot of hard work on your part and on many others. And now, what's the next step after that? Are you? Is there other ways still to be done on acknowledging the legacy of the residential schools?
Well, for one thing, I mentioned that the Indian Act has held a stranglehold over our people. It's really significantly hampered the ability of our people to progress in a more significant way that would improve the lives of our people and in turn the country. And in my view, and I hope this is shared by many of the people within within the First Nation community and other Indigenous peoples, the Indian Act should be repealed. It should be abolished. It's a racist piece of legislation, the only kind in the world. Mm-hmm. It's archaic. It's discriminatory, and it really has no place in our country. And sadly, there are still a number of our people within the community that figure that the Indian Act is what protects the rights of our people, and that's clearly not the case. And I remember when we were trying to embark on a new process, a new doing business in Manitoba, we brought forward this document called the Framework Agreement Initiative, which was really about dismantling the Department of Indian Affairs. And I remember at one meeting with a large group of people, one person got up and said, "Look, if we get rid of Indian Affairs and we take over, who's going to look after us?" And I said, "Of course we will. That's our responsibility." And that responsibility has been denied our people for a long, long time. So, in my view, that's something that ought to be taken very seriously by government.
So let's hear from Mia here. I want to introduce first Mia. Mia McKie is a citizen of Tuscarora Nation and a member of the Turtle Clan. She's in year 2 of her PhD in history. Her current research interests include the ethical research protocols, Haudenosaunee governance, Indigenous Technoscience, and environmental history. She's also a consulting scholar to the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and the American Philosophical Association. And I know that before she became a real scholar, she was playing lacrosse. She played in 2 Women's Lacrosse World Cup for team Haudenosaunee, and she was the captain, and she also builds longhouses, organizes great conferences, a great member of our community. So Mia, when you listen to Phil Fontaine, what does it speak to you in terms of reconciliation, the next steps? Where do you see yourself in that?
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. And I wanted to start off by, because this is an intergenerational dialogue, by giving thanks to the work that Mr. Fontaine has done, because I know that I am able to do the work that I do from a very different vantage point because of the work that those who've come before me have done. And I think that, and I take on that responsibility. And so thinking through these next steps of reconciliation, you know, it's easy to come from a from an activist point of view, and I think the question that I have right now, based on with the group of people here, I'm really interested in this question of multiple jurisdictions and understanding the autonomy of Indigenous nationhood in relationship to reconciliation with the Canadian state. And this is just to, I think, to open up the dialogue that not all Indigenous nations are the same, that we all have different relationships with one another and with the Canadian state and with multiple settler states around the world. And so you know, Canada has this history of being its own kind of sovereigntist entity and pulling away from the Commonwealth. We look at the Quebec state and, you know, those ideas of sovereignty there. And, you know, when we're trying to think through policies that bring people together, I'm interested in this tension that still recognizes the autonomy of Indigenous nationhood.
So that's your tension is between the pull for autonomy and the role of centralization, or wanting to have one key message or one key policy, which was the history of the settling Canada for sure. Any comments on that, Bob or Mr. Fontaine, on this tension between the autonomy of Indigenous nations and the federal state?
Well, I think Mia's point is well taken, and that is, and Phil was really embracing it as well, and that is that the next stage of reconciliation, I think, has to do with empowerment, with self-government, with autonomy, all these concepts and words that we use. Phil referred to Indigenous legal traditions and political traditions, which were completely disrespected from the time not from the time of first contact, because I think at the time of first contact, there was an effort to establish a treaty relationship. It wasn't necessarily one of equals, or that was not its perception on the European side, but certainly an effort to kind of understand that there had to be a more respectful approach to treaty making. I just got to do a little technical thing here. The challenge, I think, really is how do we embrace this in modern terms? And, we've had a lot of things that we've tried that haven't really taken us as far as we'd like. But I think the objective, the vision that I think really Phil and I have talked about this before, I think it's a vision that we really share. And that is that we have to enter into a completely respectful, equal relationship that appreciates and understands, first of all, the bad things that have happened in the past. So we have to come to grips with that. And then also move on from that to saying, how do we establish respectful relationships in the future? What form will they take? And there, I think we have to be very inventive. I don't think that some of the boxes that we put ourselves into, which have made constitutional change very, very difficult going forward, we have to look beyond those and say, okay, we have to be as creative as we can possibly be to create a path to genuine empowerment and self-government. Because the one terrible thing that the Indian Act did is really to divide the Indian nations between themselves,
Yes.
to disempower them in a very, very important way, and to take away from their capacity to really govern effectively. And getting back to effective governance seems to me what it's all about. And there's one other little point that I wanted to make, because I think we are talking in a time of pandemic. I think it's very important for all Canadians to recognize that one of the terrible effects of first contact was a very long period of illness and sickness in Indigenous communities. We caused a lot of death, a lot of damage, a lot of destruction because of the merging of these two different immune systems, which was really part of what first contact was all about. And so we, as Canadians, we need to understand pandemic is part of who we are, our history. We have to understand this, that contagion has been a very important part of our history. And I think it's important that we understand it and embrace it, because it is very, very much a part of what we are dealing with, of what reconciliation is all about now, is reconciling so many elements of our past which have been really bad, and have had very life-destroying consequences, but also to understand that we have to move forward, not like just saying move on, turn that page, forget it. No, we have to remember it, but as we remember it, we have to take the steps together. And I think the tradition, Mia will know of the traditions of the two wampum belts, the tradition of people going forward on the same stream but in different boats, and how do we give legal and political effect to that is a real challenge. But as Phil has described, it's not easy. Not everybody agrees on what that means and how it's going to happen, but it really is what the reconciliation agenda from where I sit is really all about. And I think that's the view that I'm hearing loud and clear from a number of Indigenous leaders across the country. And I think the main thing that the political leaders in the country need to realize is this has never been easy. It's complicated, and it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time. And we have to continue working on this, because we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our ancestors, but more importantly, we owe it to our children and our grandchildren.
And to the people like Mia, who will be there to continue to advocate for reconciliation. So you talk about creativity in terms of dealings with new models of co-management, of co-resource sharing. Any indications of is there success stories that we can talk about, and can we is there, should we celebrate these success stories, both for the settler side and for the Indigenous side, so that it gives people a sense that it is possible? There are ways of doing it. Any examples that you want to share?
Are you, Natalie, are you talking to me, Bob, or just generally?
Well, I was talking to you. Are they examples that you've seen recently that you thought, well, that's not bad. That's actually a good example of something good.
Well, I made the point that I wasn't discouraged and that I was an optimist, and there are many good reasons for that. And Mia is a perfect example of the significant strides that are being taken by our people to become better educated, to become more involved in the post-secondary institutions of the country, not just as students, but as professors, deans for various faculties, and in some cases, presidents, and this university or that university, and as chancellors. So we are taking our place, our rightful place in terms of education. And there are more and more of our people that are doing like Mia. And I offer her my congratulations for her efforts, doing her PhD, and it's adding to our community in terms of making it better. Politically, we've become more politically aware. We have people in various legislatures in the country, including the House of Commons and the Senate. That's making a difference. It's giving pride to our people. We feel better about ourselves because we look to the east. If you're from the east, you look to the west and you see people in Ottawa making a difference there. But in terms of the fundamental interests of our people, one area where we have been really very successful is in terms of economic development.
Yeah.
Business development, wealth creation, and that's reflected by impact benefit agreements, joint ventures, taking on equity positions in various businesses and various sectors. Not that it's entirely acceptable to a lot of our people, because we witnessed a month and a half ago the very significant, as you describe it, Mia, tensions in our community that was created by the Coastal GasLink project on the West Coast, and in the coming future with TMX, the expansion of that line. I mean, there are significant differences in our community. We have pockets of people that actually and strongly believe that economic development and wealth creation is the way forward for our people. Others are more inclined to suggest that the environment is of greater importance than being hell-bent for the oil and gas sector and mining and logging and tourism and the like. And so there's this ongoing tension in our community to figure out which is the right way to proceed. My view is that economic development, business development, wealth creation is the way to proceed. And we do it not just in this particular sector, but in all sectors that are of interest to our people. We have to do it in a collaborative way. There has to be collaboration, serious collaboration in terms of decision making, in terms of policy, in terms of giving effect to policy, because we've been besieged by too much of bad policy from Ottawa and the provincial legislatures. There's a different and better way of doing it, and that's through a collaborative approach, and that is what reconciliation is about. It's about collaboration. It's about doing things together. It's about making sure that decision making is shared by the non-Indigenous entities together with our people. And it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of doing things. And those changes are making things better for our people.
So what is your agenda, Mia? Are you thinking, what do you think you'd like to see within the next 10 years or 15 years? You know, we're talking about a journey. It's complicated. It requires efforts. But what would be milestones that you'd like to see done as we move forward?
Well, I think that it's important that, and Bob made reference to this, that we're not only looking back, but we are looking forward and understanding that there's a relationship here. There's a continuum that we're living within. And I do want to say that, you know, the Canadian state did move forward with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Other settler states like the United States have not. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves about that, and that there are steps being made, and that, you know, in the future, I would like to see a moment where we can respect multiple political jurisdictions and not these singular entities that are then recognized by another entity of its equal caliber. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of movement that's happening within the Canadian state in terms of support for, you know, Indigenous arts, classes, the hiring of peoples at institutions. But I do also heed your point, Natalie, that we have to be careful that these aren't the kind of cherry picking off of the calls to action. And we're trying to understand what systemic change looks like. And I think in this moment of pandemic, where everyone is impacted, regardless of the type of community that you come from, it really begins to expose some of those inequities that are shared by all peoples. And so I think, you know, if we start to pay attention right now, these are the sites that we can start to make change for not only Indigenous peoples, but for people who want to live in a society that's going to be here for a very long time, and not just for short-term gain.
I know that there are questions that are coming from the audience. So Ian Waddell, special hello to my pal Bob. I think Trudeau government has been all talk and no real action. And to Phil, what did Erasmus Royal Commission recommend, and what has been done from the Erasmus Royal Commission? What's the verdict there?
Well, I think the Royal Commission that Ian's referring to, which took place in the early 90s, I mean, it produced an excellent report, series of reports. It also produced a lot of very strong series of recommendations, but unfortunately, they sat on a shelf for too long. And it's only now, I think, that this current government is really trying to address them in all of their complexity. And Ian and I can go back in a partisan way and natter about these things, but I think for me the critical point is, look, to say that the Trudeau government has been all talk and no action is just not true. I mean, they've done a lot, and they're trying to do a lot. I think the question is there a whole lot more to do? The answer is yes, there is. And I think that's the key point. And I think the Royal Commission was really the first Canadian state document that set out a couple of critical things. One was the importance of understanding our history and the injustices that have marked the relationship over a very long period of time. The inequalities, the exploitation, since the agenda that we've been dealing with is the agenda that was clearly set out in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. But the other thing they set out was equally clearly was this objective of self-government, was to say we need to create new institutions of governance which will have land, which will have money and resources, and which will have jurisdiction. Any government needs those three things. You need land, you need
money. You need money, and you need human resources, which is also what what we've been talking about. Mr.
Natalie,
Yes.
I just want to make two quick points, and one to build on what Bob has just responded to Ian Waddell's question. But that was more a comment than a question from Ian, I thought. I'm actually I've been quite impressed with this government's commitment to real commitment to advancing Indigenous issues through various initiatives. One in terms of very significant allocations of resources to Indigenous communities, including the Indian and the Métis and First Nations people, and I've been really impressed with that level of commitment. And more importantly, beyond that, it's the kind of respect that's been demonstrated by the government to behave differently when dealing with Indigenous peoples and our leadership. And it's been an attempt to be more equal in expressing this commitment between, like, how many times have we seen the Prime Minister at an assembly of First Nations gatherings, chiefs gatherings? A number of times. He's had the Prime Minister has had his ministers participate in so many gatherings, not just in Ottawa, but in other parts of the country. And no, I've been pretty impressed with this government. Have they made mistakes like any other government? Of course they've made mistakes, and but I'm saying this not to be an apologist for the government. I just, I'm trying to be as objective as possible about my views on the government. The other thing I was going to say, this was in response to an earlier comment by Mia. One thing that has really impressed me about all of the talk about reconciliation, the 94 calls to action, is this commitment by a number of universities and colleges to indigenize their institutions. Mm-hmm. I see that as a pretty significant commitment. I mean, we're still trying to figure out what that all means, indigenization. But clearly, when I've listened and participated in some of the discussions around this issue, I mean, there's a real commitment to reflect the institution in a way that makes it comfortable for our people to look at these institutions as something that belongs to them in just about every way that other people look at these institutions. The other point I was going to make regarding the Royal Commission and the 440 recommendations from that inquiry, if I can call it that, because there's been so many others. Before the Royal Commission, we had the Hawthorne report, and after the Royal Commission, we had the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Winnipeg, the Jacobs Inquiry in Alberta, and so on and so forth. The thing that we shouldn't overlook is that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples devoted an entire chapter on the residential school experience. Right. And from that chapter flowed the Statement of Reconciliation. From the Statement of Reconciliation, it led to the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Mm-hmm. So it hasn't been all for naught, right? Yeah. There's a lot there that has given us ideas in how to proceed in making things better all around.
Well, the answer saying, Natalie, just one point briefly. Yeah. The Wynne government provincially worked with the First Nations leadership in Ontario to pass a new piece of legislation that was genuinely co-created by the First Nations and by the government of Ontario to create a separate governance structure for Indigenous institutes of learning, and that is part of this process that you referred to, Phil, of indigenization. It's part of the process of really trying to understand that this equal partnership actually means something. And, as we look at how governments pass legislation, the idea that the government goes off in a corner and says, well, thank you for your advice, now we're going to go and write the legislation. And I think First Nations are saying, no, we want to be holding the pen all the way to the end of the process. We don't want to be waiting till the end to hear what you've got in mind for us. And I think that's now, thanks to leaders, frankly, thanks to the leadership of Premier Wynne and others, I think it's actually starting to happen.
But so that's what we need. We need these models of whether it's co-creation of statutes, co-management, and so on, and document them and in a way seek to improve on them as we move forward on the thing. So I'm seeing another questions here from Pamela Klassen, who is a senior fellow. It says, Mia, do you think that reconciliation is still a useful concept for the work we need to do to meaningfully recognize and live within multiple jurisdictions? So.
There's been a lot of discussion on the use of the language of reconciliation, meaning that has there been a moment where we have been in good relations with one another? And I think that answer is different for every Indigenous nation and every Indigenous confederacy. And so I do think that it requires us to do a little bit more work in terms of the work that we may be doing with specific Indigenous communities, specific Indigenous nations, in terms of understanding where that point occurred, where we were in respectful relations with one another, and where that was broken. And although there have been moments that happened federally, like the residential school era, there are other historic moments that have impacted specific Indigenous nations that would need to be reconciled to get back to a point of respect. And so in terms of using that language, I do think for me, it comes down to, do you respect me as a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation, just as I respect you as a citizen of the Canadian state? And I do think that respect is a critical aspect to this language that should be inserted, but is sometimes viewed as less potent than the language of reconciliation. But to me, respect can carry more weight for both Canadians and Indigenous peoples.
Good. That's helpful. That's very interesting. I think we have a couple more questions as well here that are coming forward. But in the meantime, it looks like my screen, it's from Sarah Kaplan. Given that pandemic is part of our history, how can reconciliation shape our response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, that's a big question about. Mr. Fontaine, we know that some Indigenous communities have been hit hard with the pandemic. Their question was about, is there anything that we can learn from the history about how we react to pandemics for the future?
Well, we certainly didn't learn much from the smallpox epidemic, and how governments used that to subjugate our people. And but we shouldn't overlook the fact, too, that in the West, in terms of treaty making, the Canadian government had the deliberate policy of starving out our people, to bring them to a more compliant position in terms of the treaties that Canada was negotiating our with people, and so we shouldn't be like we shouldn't behave the way we behaved in the past in terms of dealing with these pandemics. In terms of this one, I think we have a real opportunity to do some good work. I mean, I'm thinking about the not the stimulus package in the United States, but this one in Canada, and a very large focus on the economy and businesses and the like. Well, we shouldn't overlook the fact that there are many Indigenous owned and managed businesses in Canada. They're in serious trouble. and including, for example, in the East, one of the shining examples of development and how development can be structured and managed, and the kind of benefits it can bring forward. I mean, they're on the verge of bankruptcy, and so when we talk about stimulus, we're not thinking about Indigenous owned and managed businesses. I know another company in Northern Alberta, one of the significant success stories. They've had to lay off most of their staff.
Okay.
This is a company that was just one of the best in the country in terms of Indigenous employees, Indigenous managed business and ownership. And so I think we have to give some very serious thought in terms of how the government ought to support Aboriginal businesses in every part of the country. I was also going to raise one other question, and this is more to Bob Rae than Ian and other folks. How difficult would it be to set aside a position, 2 seats in the Supreme Court of Canada, specifically for Indigenous community? Because
I think there's a lot
of difference of
merit in that. Are you getting me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, you can. Yeah.
On the right side, okay, now I can, Bob. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No. I think it's as one of a number of steps I think that we need to take. I do think that it's impossible to talk about equality without talking about our institutions, and the institutions would have to include the Supreme Court of Canada, the Senate, the House of Commons, as well as provincial institutions. I mean, I think we are, that's what I'm saying, we're in early days of really coming to terms with what this new agenda is all about. Just one word on the reconciliation, just one thought is that the difficulty I think a lot of people have with the word is that it's frequently used to say, you have to reconcile yourself to something. You have to accept something. And I think that the word reconciliation may not be, as we go forward, I'm not suggesting we abandon its use altogether, but I think we have to add to it another series of words that really mean empower, that mean a genuine and deep partnership that's based on a principle of respect, of recognition, and of equality. And I think maybe the word reconciliation doesn't quite go far enough in expressing that thought.
Well, probably part of the evolution of language is we need to use the word reconciliation to criticize it and see that it doesn't go far enough. And it opens the door to wanting to add nuance to it, to really capture all the good things. Another good questions here from Noel Semple. Mr. Fontaine mentioned need for recognition of Indigenous people as founders of Canada. Could you say a bit more of the form that this should take? That is, is it a resolution of Parliament? Is it a constitutional amendment that would be necessary or that you would seek? Mr. Fontaine.
Well, I'm not looking at that process as being constitutional driven. I'm thinking, for example, that the Supreme Court of Canada wasn't created through the Constitution, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. It's through legislation, Bob.
Yes.
And,
yes. Act of the federal parliament.
Yes, the Official Languages Act, but not through a constitutional process.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a number of very important institutions that were created not through a constitutional process, but as Bob mentioned, an act of parliament through legislation. And I don't see any good reason why we couldn't effect this kind of recognition, not through a constitutional process, but by legislation. I think it's entirely possible. Maybe I'm dreaming in Technicolor here, but why not?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's dreaming at all. I think to me the logical thing is that the Indian Act will have to be replaced by something.
Yeah.
The Indian Act, I think the concern that a number of people have about, well, if we get rid of the Indian Act, we don't have any protections. I don't. It's not a perspective that I agree with, but I hear it and I understand it. And so I think politically, I think what the government needs to do, and any federal government would need to do, would be to, and I wouldn't make it a big public process at the beginning. It needs to be a series of conversations about saying, well, what is it that one could do to succeed the Indian Act, to replace it with a new expression of the relationship, because the Indian Act is an act of colonialism. It's filled with the colonial mentality. So it should be repealed, in my opinion, but it needs to be replaced with something. And the moment of that replacement would be the moment at which it seems to me one could readily say in the preamble, what is the nature of this relationship? And I don't think it lends itself easily to a constitutional change, because I was in that swamp for a long period of time. I don't really want to go back to it, but I do think that there are ways of doing it, and I think there are ways for provincial legislatures to follow suit, and for there to be a clear expression of the nature of this partnership. But that to me is part of the work that needs to be done. But that work in turn has to be followed by real change, real empowerment on the land, and that's where it needs to happen.
So there are other questions. I think we're running out of questions from the audience, but I was surprised that nobody mentioned UNRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Is it because it's too remote or too far, or are we looking more for an agenda that's rooted in the problematic Canadian history, but responding to the concrete issues and wanting to be a little bit more creative in the outcomes? So I'm surprised that nobody questioned whether UNRIP was relevant or not.
Gosh, I on my part, it was just an oversight. When I first introduced the subject of reconciliation, I should have, in terms of next steps, I should have included the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Interests of Indigenous Peoples. I mean, it took so long to write the Declaration and then to get it adopted by the UN. I mean, we all remember that four countries refused to adopt it initially: the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And the United States is the only nation state that is still not moved to adopt the Declaration. But I don't know if the U.S. is keen to do anything that comes from the United Nations.
That's
and this is the most recent example of that.
But I do think that the UN Declaration, first of all, Canadians, including, and Phil is being very modest, but Canadians played a very strong role in the negotiation and the passage of the Declaration. The second is that we've always had a connection between what we've done at home and what's been done internationally. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was a product of the post-war era, was very much a product of where Canadians had a strong role in developing it. But it also had a big impact on the thinking in Canada about the Charter. And I think it's very important for us to embrace the progress that's been made at the Declaration, because the UN Declaration is about ending colonialism and dealing with the long-term impacts of colonialism on the state structures that were established in the colonial world, and how a lot of Indigenous people, millions, tens of millions, billions of Indigenous people were impacted by that long historical development and by its conclusion. So you have a new era. And it seems to me Canada has to be part of that era very much. And certainly I think there are a number of other countries. I think New Zealand in particular has gone down that path as well as us.
Yeah. So I was going to leave. We have 3 minutes, and so I was just going to first ask Mia to reflect a little bit and just have concluding comments from people. And so Mia.
Yes, I mean, I think that actually the last point on UNDRIP really does tie together this question, looking for other frameworks that have already been established, because they're out there. But if we as a society choose to interact with them is another question. And so UNDRIP exists, treaties exist, there are frameworks that outline the types of relationships that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations have with other European nations. And so I think that frameworks are there, and it's also about time we ask the question if we want to embrace these structures that have been laid out for us, and what types of changes they may need to take us into the future.
Bob, any final comments?
Well, one of my great mentors is Peter Russell, who's a former professor at the university and somebody who's talked a lot about some of the things we've been talking about today. And Peter's always referred to this as our odyssey. This is our journey. And I think we need to embrace it as a journey for Canada. It's the journey that we're on. It's the journey that continues. And some people like to look to the past and say, that's all there is. But I think the meaning of our lives is that we're building these relationships all the time.
And Mr. Fontaine, last word to you.
Well, one of the most encouraging things that I've witnessed in recent years is the change in language that's used to describe the relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples, and particularly when it comes to development. Now, I mentioned earlier joint ventures and equity positions and ownership and impact benefit agreements and all of that being guided by UNDRIP, particularly the section on free, prior, and informed consent. And that has been embraced by a large number of the interests that are engaging with our people pretty much on a daily basis. And so that, to me, reflects the acceptance of such concepts, and the acceptance of that means that there's been a change of attitude, because you can't have a change in language, right, and expressions without a change in attitude. And this is what I find particularly encouraging for the future.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, what a wonderful conversation we had with Mr. Fontaine and Bob Rae and Mia McKie. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Miigwech. I want to thank also the staff at the Massey College who are doing all the work behind the scene. Thank you to Matthew Glanwald and to Abra Risi and to Catherine Fowler as well. So tomorrow at Massey Dialogues, we will be talking with Professor Anita McGann and James Orbinski about Agenda for Global Health. So you may want to join in at noon. And on Thursday, we'll have a conversation with our new Senior Fellow, Dr. Sunit Das, and it's going to be orchestrated by Junior Fellows Gurveer Baines, and she will be interviewing him. Dr. Das is a philosopher who became a neurosurgeon. So lots of good things happening here. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for being part of this. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you. Thank you so much.